So, welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider, a podcast series with folks who I regard as among the most interesting in the industry next to innovation. And I'm delighted to welcome someone I've known for a short while, Jen Horonjeff, um, who certainly, if you were aware of what we did at JP Morgan, you'll have probably seen a photograph of Jen, which we'll get to. Became one of the highlights of JP Morgan 2020, which may be one of the last great JP Morgans. So Jen, welcome to Idea Collider.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you maybe start by telling us a little bit about you and your journey and Savvy Co-op and what it is and really what it's bringing to our industry?
Yeah, absolutely. So, my lens is always sort of through the patient perspective. And that is really where to sort of begin my journey. I was diagnosed as an infant with juvenile idiopathic arthritis, among several other autoimmune conditions, both rare and more common. I had a brain tumor removed maybe 7.5 years ago. So, just that to say, it's something that I've always dealt with and it's really informed sort of the path that I took and I'm still taking. I ended up first thinking I was going to be a physician, but honestly, here in the States, seeing firsthand that my providers couldn't even practice the medicine that they wanted to based on our systems that would prevent them from prescribing what they wanted to prescribe or whatever types of treatments they wanted to advise me to take. So I was a little bit put off and decided perhaps there was another way that I could help. And ultimately, I ended up becoming a human factors engineer and human centered designer working in healthcare. Went on to get my PhD in environmental medicine, which is a totally loaded term. I was studying patient centered outcomes and what else affects somebody's health and health behaviors outside of just the clinical factors that we've traditionally been looking at, because I just was seeing that the patient priorities were not the same as the clinicians, the payers, the sponsors, all of these things. So, how could we look at the treatment guidelines that we have or the clinical trial measures so that when a drug does hit the market, we are able to do the elusive shared decision making, but we have to understand that a way to get the patients the information that they need to make said decision. And so that was really kind of my lens there. I was also an FDA advisor as their consumer representative for many, many years. And all of this helped to give me the perspective from several different vantage points that there are a lot of fabulous people out there who are wanting to improve the lives of patients. They just didn't have all the information that they needed. And so they were guessing what patients wanted. I saw a lot of people talking about it, and I still do every day because that's the industry that I am in. But it's a lot of people guessing, and it's bananas to me because the answers are right there if you just actually connect with the right patients.
No.
And I'm very open about my conditions, and so what would happen would be that people would say, "Hey, Jen, will you be that patient on this committee or that project?" And I was flattered at first, but honestly, it's a big diversity issue if somebody who's white with a PhD and lives in New York City is answering on behalf of all patients with my condition.
No.
And so that's really kind of what led to what is now Savvy Cooperative, which is an online platform that helps to connect companies and innovators directly with diverse patients. We work across all conditions. We excel in rare disease, really because we have a very different model for how we connect with patients. And it's because we are a cooperative, which means that we're collectively owned by patients. And so when we have requests for patients for whatever criteria, we're able to activate our network of patients and they go into their closed communities and are able to pull in new and diverse people. And so that is sort of my story and my jam and why I care so much about making sure that we can improve healthcare for all individuals.
Yeah, and that insight, I think, it was really appealing to me because, the biggest question I always had when someone wanted to talk about the patient was, which patient are you hoping to listen to with a perspective here? Do you find that our industry comes with good questions or openness to listening?
I think many do. And it's interesting because the people that I meet and interact with and used to run into at conferences, oftentimes it's those people who really truly want to do the work and are willing to talk to patients and all of these things. But naturally, these systems are huge, and like a pharma company has so many different levels and org trees to get through. And so with that, I think one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to get buy-in.
Mm,
So I think a lot of people still look at patient input as sort of the nice to have, cute and fluffy stuff that you get at the end, just
mhm,
to validate all that you've done before to get sort of that seal of approval and checkbox, as opposed to seeing it as a truly valuable source of co creation throughout the product development and commercialization. People just kind of like throw it in at the end. And some people have admitted to us that they're actually scared to get patient input because they're afraid of undoing all the work that they've done.
right.
So it's kind of like, just I don't want to see it, I don't want to hear it. That also seems ill informed.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
kind of where we see it. I think that the industry is going in that direction. People talk about being patient centered. They just need to actually take actionable steps to do it.
Mm. Yeah, and I remember we tried to collaborate on a project that really opened my eyes to. I think I ended up writing an article which was patients at the center but out of reach, which was just about how much this company had set its rules up to stop the company talking to patients instead of to spend any time listening, because of that kind of natural reaction in a pharma company that you're not supposed to talk because talking means selling, not listening. So is that an issue that you kind of come across a lot?
Yeah, and we we work with so many different pharma companies, and we don't work with some of them because we sort of see the spectrum of talking with all of our, industry colleagues, kind of thinking about some pharma companies that are sort of very innovation forward and those that are more innovation proof, that they have just set up so many guardrails for themselves, mostly perceived barriers. Uh, because yeah, they think like if you're going to talk to patients to understand disease burden, somehow that's inappropriate and you're going to do some off-label marketing there. That's what, like, we if we
Mm,
step back and try to say why do these rules exist
mhm,
and where are they actually applicable, then just talking to patients to hear what it's like to live with their condition should certainly not make anybody feel uncomfortable. So I think that's where we just see some companies are sort of leading the way in understanding that. And if there are things they need to reevaluate, then they'll take a step back. But there are those that are just so afraid to even take a step forward.
yeah, yeah, because it's hard, right? Because as you say, to get to the point of hearing, a patient relevant endpoint that may need to be validated in phase two to incorporate in your phase three means listening from very early on, and also avoiding that kind of paternalistic view that we know what's best for these patients.
Yeah.
So what can they possibly tell us? Are you finding that some companies are engaging early enough to get
Oh,
that input?
absolutely. And we're so thrilled that some companies are now instilling it sort of in their internal protocols,
Hmm.
that this is just how we do drug development now, that you are expected to engage patients throughout. And I think that that is a really wonderful example of the evolution of this. I kind of feel that we had sort of the past decade where people got away with just calling themselves patient centered,
Right.
but now it's those that are not just making it like a tagline, but in fact figuring out sort of the processes to make sure that it's happening internally. So we're getting there, and I think one of the big issues that I see is sort of this like hold up and fear of sort of the perfect patient engagement. And companies like just stall because they want to make sure they're doing everything right and perfectly. And I'm not just talking about from like a legal and compliance standpoint. And we encourage folks to just take a step, try one project, see how it goes, learn from it, iterate on it. Please don't let it be your only project. So therefore, it doesn't have to be perfect. And that's what I just would hope that people could leave with, is just try something, please.
Yeah. And do you find that, because I think there are so many demands now on, um, you know, ethically conducting studies that are, where equality of access is a desirable goal, where diversity is properly reflected. Do you feel like they're panicking about solving all of those things in one go, and therefore they're pushing it down the line?
You know, I don't know if they're trying to put it off. I actually would still love to see more people double down on
Mm,
making sure that they're getting diverse input. It's interesting because I use sort of we as an industry, but I think for us, it's something that we've been trying to champion all along. That if we get more virtual input, it allows us to be more inclusive.
mm,
Because at least here in the States, so much of this type of user experience or market research traditionally happens in San Francisco, New York, and Boston, which obviously is not representative. And so, if we can have more virtual engagements, be it through surveys, focus groups, interviews, we have a whole insights platform that we rolled out in the past several months during the pandemic to collect these kinds of insights virtually. It just allows us to open up, and I think that, a lot of the opportunities we provide now on our platform are asynchronous, which is another important thing to think about. If you're not beholden to time zones, work schedules, obviously people are now trying to juggle work and family and, child responsibilities and their school and all of these things. So if we can provide opportunities for patients to still give direct input, but to do it in a way that fits their lifestyle, it also allows for us to have more inclusivity.
yeah, fantastic. And this kind of, can you elaborate a little bit more on this kind of patient-owned nature of Savvy? Because we want to get into this sort of conversation about innovation and so on. And I think that what you've done there sounds, intriguing.
Yeah, I know it's very different. So we are a cooperative, a public benefit co-op. And what it means is that patients are eligible to join our co-op. It's a choice. And when they do, then they become co-owners. And that gives them a voice in our organization, and it makes them eligible to share in our profits. And this really came out of the fact that myself and my co-founder, Ronnie Sharp, are both patients ourselves, and it felt uncomfortable to us to essentially be making money off the backs of our patient peers. We have essentially a gig economy marketplace. And so it's as if you were thinking about, what if the drivers owned Uber or the hosts owned Airbnb? And there actually are co ops out there that are trying to do just this. But it's this idea of those who are creating value. How can we make sure that they're also seeing the benefits? And especially since at Savvy, what we do is make sure that patients have a voice in the industry and that they're equitably valued and fairly compensated for their time and expertise. The co op model actually matches that just perfectly, because what the co op does is give people a vote or a voice in our organization and makes them eligible to share in our profits. And it's certainly different, but I think that we were pleasantly surprised that the industry actually cared about our structure. When we created the structure, we thought it was the patients that would, get on board with this. But we found that clients, if they have a choice of where to put their dollars, they rather patronize a organization that gives that back to patients.
Hmm.
But also, it just helps us do our job better. And we didn't necessarily foresee this at the beginning, but because of our model, because our members utilize this peer-to-peer outreach model, we're able to recruit faster. We're able to find more diverse patients and very rare patients, those needle in a haystack, and we're able to find sort of that quality participant. Unfortunately, I still don't understand why, but people sometimes in the market research industry like to fake having conditions so that they can earn a few extra dollars here and there. And, I won't question their motives, but faking having certain, terminal illnesses is always questionable to me. But we verify all of our patients. So all of our patients are real and they have the conditions that they say they have. So our model, while we think it's the ethical thing to do, again, it actually helps us do our job better and serve our clients better, which serves the industry and then therefore makes the world better for patients.
Yeah. And does it sit alongside or in counterpoint to the kind of traditional patient organization where, I think pharma was often collaborative with patient groups, and on and off depending on their development sort of wishes. Um, how does Savvy sit alongside a kind of a cystic fibrosis foundation or a Michael J. Fox?
We see it as complementary. What we found, both myself and my co-founder, we grew up in those organizations, and they're very important and they serve a very important role. But they're disease specific, and they're traditionally focusing on things like education and programming and policy and advancing, giving grants into that kind of scientific research. And what they struggled with was doing what we do, which is sort of this matchmaking, because that's not what they're set out to do.
Right.
And so that is sort of the niche that we fill, is helping to make sure that we can connect with individual patients. Because one of the things that I know has traditionally happened is, again, how do we get the patient perspective? Well, we'll reach out to the patient group, and then it might be an executive or, a staff member that's doing the speaking on behalf of patients, but that's still not a true patient perspective. And so all we're trying to do is try to say there's still another layer of talking to the individual patients. Now, I fully recognize that pharma companies and biotech will also want to have those relationships with those advocacy organizations for when drugs come to market or trial recruitment or whatever that might be. But it doesn't always give the same level of perspective when we're talking about the type of work that we do. And so we work with advocacy organizations, the disease specific ones, like you mentioned, in a couple of ways. One, to sort of partner to also help to recruit, and we make sure that we're doing a revenue share with that organization so that they are benefiting from it. Again, as a co op, we do nothing unless it is equitable. But what we also found is that those advocacy organizations, when they are getting requested from other companies to find patients, they actually send those companies to us to sort of manage that, because again, they don't have the same internal capacity to do that. So we take on all the contracting and legal work and working with the patients and paying out the patients so that we can take on that burden, because that's just what we do. And then again, we get to set up a relationship with them so that they benefit as well. So we just see everybody as kind of an important stakeholder that just serves their roles in different ways.
It's really interesting. And when it comes to I think the thing at JP Morgan with you in the hospital gown was, it was about that kind of three-dimensional, four-dimensional patient experience of much more than just the disease. And I'll always remember the story that I heard a lung cancer patient tell me that she thought that the company was more interested in her bringing her cancer to a clinical trial site than they were in her. All she was a vessel for bringing this thing to be measured and attacked. And I think that perspective that you had of the whole patient sort of came through that night, and then much of the coverage that followed. That to me has always felt like part of your philosophy.
Yeah, I think it's trying to understand that the patient perspective, while unique between any one of us individual patients, but again, it's just a different stakeholder. And I think at JP Morgan, where it's a bunch of innovators and executives and investors that are talking about what is the next great trend or what should we be investing in now. If you don't understand the needs and priorities of those patients that you're trying to serve, then you're just completely missing the mark. And this is what frustrates me with innovations, is that if you're just guessing, then it is going to fail. Like, this is how you set yourself up for failure. And it is not doing a service to those innovators, to the investors that are investing in products that are not going to meet the mark, and of course to patients. Like, why are we wasting all of our time and money trying to build out things that they don't want or need? I can't tell you how many workshops I've walked out of, not out of spite, but left after the conclusion of said meeting, where the patients that we've kind of brought in are sort of giving feedback on various different, ideas. And so many patients are like, please don't make another app. And I just feel
Hmm.
like this is
Yeah.
this is what we're seeing right now a lot of as well around digital health and telehealth. And I'm not bashing telehealth because I think it's super important, but right now we see a lot of people just throwing technology at the problem, and we haven't taken a step back to say, wait, is this what patients want? Does it fit seamlessly into their life? Or are you actually now just overburdening them because you're creating a lot of different new technologies or tools or products or services that don't interact well together, and it just becomes more and more cumbersome for that individual. So that was really the point that I was trying to make at JP Morgan, was just, if we don't have people that are specifically there to share patient experience. This is also the problem when people say, but we're all patients. This, but we're all patients is sort of the all lives matter of healthcare, where it's not valuing the individual experiences and challenges of specific demographics of patients. And so if you had knee surgery last year, it does not mean that you know what it's like to live with metastatic breast cancer.
Right.
And so we just need to say, yes, we all are people that are going to experience the healthcare system. Fabulous. That galvanizes us and makes us excited to go change. Fantastic. But when you're innovating for that metastatic breast cancer patient, then please go talk to metastatic breast cancer patients. Don't
Right.
guess what that's like.
Yeah. And 24 hours a day of it as well, rather than because I think one of the kind of misconceptions that I've always felt from clients has been this. What are we going to learn about epilepsy from an epilepsy patient? We know how the disease works. You go, yeah, but the rest of it, the science, you might not ask a patient about, but the rest of it, surely the lived experience must be worth something. And I remember taking like 20 of the team from an epilepsy company. We watched a movie which was about a young woman with epilepsy, and we asked a question at the end of the movie, and they were all shocked, sitting there just like stunned at what this actually looks like. None of them, not one of the 20, had ever seen anyone have a seizure ever. I thought, well, there you go. There's already a starting point. So that kind of idea that if you involve a patient to talk about the disease, well, we've got loads of people that know about this stuff, but the rest of it seems like it's wide open for discovery.
Yeah. And so when with my sort of academic research around patient-centered outcomes, I did a lot of that work in rheumatology. What we saw in that was that, the HCPs were the most cared about things like swelling, joint swelling, and tenderness, and patients cared about pain, which should seem obvious, but it's not, and it was not often in previous studies wasn't always measured, and fatigue, which it was not did not used to be measured in rheumatology, and now we've redone a lot of the outcome measure sets to include fatigue and so many different autoimmune conditions. Ronnie, my co-founder, just gave a presentation earlier this week that during it he gave a great example. You know, he has absolutely exemplified how fabulous clinical trials are to me. So he has cystic fibrosis, has been in an unnamed clinical trial, you can guess, and his life has absolutely changed. And I have seen it firsthand. He has not been hospitalized since the end of 2018, and I used to see him get hospitalized every few months prior to that. So I am a believer. But what he was saying in this presentation was that they measure lung function. And his lung function is similar to what it was maybe 10 years ago at this juncture, which is quite good.
Yeah.
But how he would describe his life 10 years ago versus now is completely different, because this medication allows him to live his life in a completely different way than before, when he was bleeding or had other issues and different types of treatment that prevented him from living his life in the way that he wanted. But if you're only measuring lung function, then it looks like, it's apples to apples. But that's what he's trying to say. And what we're trying to say as patients is, if you don't understand sort of the quality of life aspects, then you're not getting the full picture.
Mm.
It's actually something that, as serving as an FDA advisor, when we would have sponsors come in to the advisory committees and present, I was the squeaky wheel that would always ask about these types of measures. And what I actually found fascinating was that there were more and more that were starting to measure quality of life, but they were backup slides. They were always backup slides. They didn't
Yeah.
lead with this information. And it's like, this is your opportunity to present in an open public forum that you actually have done the work and care about these things. So why are you not taking the time? Why is this a backup slide? Why is this an afterthought?
Mm,
And, I think it speaks to what people think is most important. And that's unfortunate.
mm. Yeah, that kind of efficacy perception that it's all about the efficacy, and if you take care of that, everything else takes care of itself. Which, as we all know, I think sometimes it's a complication, right? As you said, it actually confounds or makes the trial more complicated if these are seen as side effects or some other effect of treating the disease.
Yeah, I think that the more the FDA starts and the EMA and others will start to show not only that these things are important, I think that that's a problem. People keep waiting for more guidance and it's not really coming. They say you should do patient engagement, it's good, and people say, well, how? And that's where the importance. So we have to rely on those others that see how important it is.
Fantastic. So I want to bridge you into the kind of broad subject of innovation because I really value your perspective here. So do you have a working definition of innovation?
I think I perhaps have what others have sort of recited back too, that innovation being something that is then actually adopted, that innovation for innovation's sake, if nobody wants it, nobody uses it, is not actually truly an innovation. It's a waste of time and money. So I think that trying to figure out something that people will use. And even as I say that aloud, I don't want to say that innovation that fails is wasted innovation because I think we should have an opportunity to learn from it. But I think that those that lead with a certain hubris that just creating something new without doing the due diligence about what do people actually want, that's the kind of stuff that I don't believe is advancing,
Mm,
future innovations.
mm. Yeah, that kind of distinction, invention and innovation, absolutely what you're saying. And do you approach that at Savvy as a kind of active process? So you've described some kind of interesting learnings and serendipitous discoveries and so forth. Is it, but does it remain an active process for you?
Absolutely. I mean, both for how we do business, we are a business, so we have to learn and adapt to our own client needs and to the patients themselves. So I certainly think about it through that lens that we would be complete hypocrites if we did not innovate ourselves. But I think what we see in sort of the healthcare industry is we're able to see and learn best practices because
Mm,
this is all we do all day every day, and so it allows us to hopefully help other companies innovate better, innovate
mm,
smarter and faster because we're able to see where these things get held up and sort of advise along the way. So I think that that's something that is sort of a beautiful side effect of ending up as experts in this sort of area, that we can help companies sort of try to avoid the pitfalls
mm,
that others before them have had. Because again, it's okay to fail, but let's continue to learn from it.
mm. And how do you know that something is kind of an insight or something is true or so if people are looking for input, how do you know that you've got it?
Well, I feel like at this point, Ronnie needs to trademark his little hourglass idea. So I will give full credit to him. But he likes to think about innovation and what kind of input and what level of input are you getting at different checkpoints along the way.
Mm,
And so the idea, I will use my hands to show you an hourglass, that there are times that you want to go broader and to go out and get a little larger sample of different types of insights and input. And then you can sort of reflect on that and go deeper with a smaller subset of the population. And that's a kind of way to gather insights and then validate the hypotheses and then learn from it and do it again. And that's also how I sort of see sort of the patient insights and the deeper insights that we do here at Savvy marrying with big data as well. Big data is a signal, and it just really helps you see trends and if something's wrong, but it doesn't tell you why or how to fix it. And so that's when you need to then go and talk to specific patients to say, this is what we saw. What's going on here? And you can then start to see one beautiful example of this was actually a study that was presented on at a FDA meeting that I was at. It was in RA, and they were using wearables to track activity. And what they were doing then was trying to correlate activity with reduced pain.
Hmm.
And they saw somebody that their pain level was going down, but so was their activity level. And they thought, well, that's weird. They called up this patient to then say, is something wrong? Are you wearing your wearable, etc.? And the patient said, oh, yeah, but I feel so great that I'm an author and I finally feel that I can sit down and actually write because I don't have as much pain and fatigue as I used to. So it just goes to show again that you need to understand which outcomes and endpoints are we even looking at. But you wouldn't have known that unless you did the work and talked
Yeah.
to patients. And so that's what I think about when we think about the variety of ways that you can get input and that there's no one size fits all. And that's what I kind of referring back to before, like what's the perfect patient engagement? Well, there isn't one, but you just kind of need to know where are you on sort of your product development roadmap
Yeah.
and then get the appropriate kind and not wait 6 months to do it again.
Yeah. And that learning that you're describing there, if someone hadn't made that phone call, you can imagine rooms full of very smart people sitting and wondering why before you learned, and then actually learned what that would mean for the next engagement,
Right.
in terms of comfort
Yeah.
staying still.
That's what like a wearable is not going to tell you everything. It's,
Right.
these are fascinating data points. And I think that they
Yeah.
are, again, complementary to other kinds of information that we're collecting.
Yeah.
I also think, if I have a platform here to speak my mind, this is one of the problems I see about patient reported outcomes too.
Mhm.
That just because it's patient reported does not actually mean that the patient cares about it. I could say that my hair is brown, but that doesn't mean if my arthritis is under control or not. So I
Right.
think that some people get hung up and say, oh, yeah, but we did a PRO. Well, what the heck did you ask people? Did those
Mm.
things matter? So
Mm.
thinking about what are those patient centered outcomes as opposed to just patient reported ones.
Yeah, yeah, and another one of my favorite people in this space, Alison Campbell, who's at AstraZeneca now. She talks about patient relevant outcomes, instead of patient reported, because I think that was one of the big sort of issues at the time. Right, it was it's easy to collect them, uh,
Yeah.
and to then question their validity. But as soon as you get into relevant outcomes, you're into a different mindset.
Yeah.
Um, so what have been your, relatively short, I guess, timeline, but what have been your learnings in the times you work with industry and biotech? What would your advice be for companies?
Well, I think I've shared some that, well, the first and foremost that I will repeat over and over again is ask patients, ask patients, ask patients.
Mhm.
Please see them as a valuable stakeholder. It is not a competing opinion, it is just another piece of important information.
Yeah.
And when you ask patients, also, this is where I have this sort of personal conflict because I have a co op. I sort of gave away the company before we even started it. So I'm not a money driven person, but I hear myself parroting this advice over and over again. So take it with a grain of salt. But it is so important that you actually need to budget for these things. It is one of the big challenges that we see is people coming back and saying, oh, we don't have a budget for it. Well, then what do you think? This stuff is like free, that patients should just be giving things away? It takes money and work, and people should be treated equitably. If you're going to pay statisticians and designers and all these other stakeholders, clinicians, then you need to set aside a budget for patients as well. We had a company, we work with a lot of pharma, digital therapeutics, biotech, et cetera, and again, bless them for wanting to get patient input. And so we've been working with them to understand like what does it take? Like what is a budget? And when they come to us and they say, here's what we've allotted, we're like, that's not even enough to pay the patients, let alone for us to help provide that work and service. So these are just the challenges. So I would say identify that you need to ask patients, then what are you going to do to make sure that you get it? I think this is another conversation around diversity and inclusion that companies are having as well, that we can't just say that we want that. You have to actually set aside resources and make a plan to do it. So think about that in sort of the same lens as thinking about patient input. especially if you want diverse patient input. Are you going to go back to the same people over and over again because they're lower hanging fruit and you already have the connection? So maybe you
Right.
don't have to pay as much.
Yeah.
So thinking about it from that sort of angle. And then, as I said before, start somewhere. Nobody's expecting perfection. Learn from it and then take the next step with those insights that you learn.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess the parallel will be the same as pharma goes through with key opinion leaders, right? That back in the day, they were very useful for telling the world what you wanted the world to be told. But if you wanted to listen to unmet needs, some of those folks had never seen a patient in 10 years because they just stood on conference platforms, telling the world the way it was. And I guess there's that transition is still to happen with patients as well. Um, so a lot of what you've done has been kind of inventive and innovative in getting it done. So how do you personally deliver more of what you want and less of what you don't?
Oh, well, I think, if I sort of could wave a magic wand, if all the things that I just said happened, it would allow us to then provide more opportunities for companies to get input because don't have to convince them anymore that this is actually important. I mean, I don't know how much of my week is taken up having these conversations to get buy-in from people about why it's important. It's interesting because for us, some of our best clients are even the third parties who are working on behalf of other sponsors because then it's their work to do the convincing, but we don't have to convince them. They know that they need this to deliver a better marketing campaign or to develop a better clinical trial protocol and all of these things. They get they need to talk to patients. And so it's almost like sometimes they end up being a buffer, and then we don't even have to sell them. They sell us for themselves because they know they just need to go and find those patients and get that kind of insight so they can deliver a better product and service. So I think if pharma could wake up to that faster, then it would allow us to not have to spend so much time talking about it and then creating more and more new innovative ways to collect those kinds of insights and to take it all further. So
Mm,
do us all a favor and understand its importance so we can provide more for you.
mm. How do you see, because clearly farmers move towards chief patient officers in some places. Do you see that as a positive step or potentially a misstep?
It's a great question. I don't think that I can label it as one or the other. I think every company's organizational structure is different. I have yet to figure out two pharma companies that I can compare. But here are some of the things that I see either as challenges or perhaps ways to restructure is we can't just have a figurehead and think that now we've solved it. Sometimes what I see is that those individuals, a chief patient officer, et cetera, doesn't have a budget for these kind of things. So while they might want to do it, they themselves really don't have much of a say. They just kind of oversee other teams, but is up to either like the brand team or whomever that is the one that you would then go to. There are other companies that have more of their innovation teams that are hopefully driving this kind of stuff. But again, they're segmented away from the specific disease or therapeutic areas at times. The other challenge around some of this too being that of course R&D and commercial don't communicate, and I understand there are reasons for that, but it's so funny, like back when I went to conferences, that I would run into somebody and they'd be like, "Oh, we should work with you guys." I'm like, well, "You already do. Your pharma company does. Like, we have an agreement with you all. You can work with us right now." But they don't know because they don't talk to each other. These organizations are so big. So I think that those are some of the challenges. Well, how to fix it, I don't necessarily have a prescription for that, but just trying to understand that putting people in certain roles with certain titles without either budget or authority to make certain decisions um, is probably not the most valuable way to ensure that your company is patient centered.
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen that same diversity of approach. I mean, it is exactly the same as a chief innovation officer, which is, a role that is either pointless or given to someone so they can go to CES every year. Um, it's hard to know exactly how much the company embraces it when it appoints someone like that until they then are given some room to maneuver.
Exactly, and I don't wanna, throw that under the bus. I do see it happen, really, impactfully at some companies, but again, I think it's empowering people with not only title, but agency and the resources to do the kind of work that they were brought in to do.
Absolutely. So I think we've got a hint, but what kind of drives you personally, forwards?
Oh gosh, you don't know yet? Money. No. Um, obviously, I think that I've said it before, it's really just I've lived it. I know what these patients are going through to a point, but that's what like this recognition too that I also have zero clue what other patients go through. And so I think as somebody that cares about healthcare, social justice, all of these things that I feel are deeply, important, I it's what keeps me up at night and gets me up at morning. I just feel like there's so much work to be done and I hope that someday I'm out of a job. But until then, I'll just keep ruffling feathers trying to help people think about things from a different perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great insight. That knowing that you don't know what patients are going
Totally.
through is absolutely the kind of key to that, right?
Yeah, let's all lead with a little bit more humility and
Yeah,
vulnerability as we approach our jobs because
yeah,
I think that that's when we get into trouble is if we think we know or we're too afraid to admit that we
yeah.
don't because then we are not empowering ourselves to go seek those answers.
Yeah, no, the power of "I don't know" it doesn't get used very often, right? um, so I want to. I always because there's a kind of book review club within Idea Collider as well. So I'm intrigued by which books you'd recommend to anyone either in your space or in general.
Oh gosh, books. I usually back when I'm set up, I have like my bookcases behind me. One that I certainly think was impactful for me thinking about things differently. Adam Grant's The Originals. If you have not read that,
Hmm.
great sort of perspective on how can we think outside the box. What have we learned from other people across all different industries to think about things that way. I just spoke about vulnerability. So Brené Brown and all of her wonderful work about vulnerability, both when leading and parenting and all of that. There's also great works like How to Survive a Plague and what we've learned from the activism from the AIDS and HIV and ACT UP communities. There's new books about, invisibility and disability that I think I would encourage people to check out. But yeah, I think just being encouraged by trying to open your mind and read different types of books is always important.
Yeah, no, there's such a great richness of text out there for anyone as soon as they go diving, and I'm always fascinated that again clients don't even just take the time to look at Twitter or YouTube or whatever just to get a hint of what patients are saying about their conditions um, on the way through. So, and then probably the last major question. So, where do you see you and Savvy, in 5 years' time?
Whew, it's always so hard. Nobody predicted 2020, so take this all,
Yeah,
with a certain grain of salt. But what I would like to see Savvy set up in such a way that it just becomes so easy and seamless. We've proven that out to companies that again, there's no excuse to not get patient insights. I'm going to keep developing out our offerings so that we can help get those diverse virtual input more and more seamlessly for both the patients and the clients. And then again, keep reaching even beyond I think sort of what we think about as where patients should give input. Again, my background as doing human factors and having arthritis, a lot of this sort of got started with me working outside of healthcare and working in just everyday products. People with impairments should be giving feedback on things like kitchen tools and vacuums and makeup
yeah,
cases and all these kind of things that I was getting brought in and asked for patients with like arthritis, cerebral palsy, etc. That we need to create a world that is adaptable and accessible to people with all types of abilities. And so that's where I would like to see us going too, is to create a model, show that it can work, show that our co-op is a valuable, successful, sustainable model to include, users in the ownership of companies, and then
Uh,
to just keep going.
Fantastic. Well, I'll be standing right behind you. I think that it's such a powerful, um, insight into why we come to work, right? That if we come to work just to connect molecules with pill balls and hope that doctors write prescriptions, that's we're doing something wrong. So, if people want to find out more about you, Jen, what's the best way to point them?
Gosh, you wanna know about me? Well, then go watch a puppet video. If you don't know what I'm talking about yet, then you are really missing out. Um, I would just say to go to our website at Savvy, which is savvy.coop, and I actually had no idea that so many people would misspell savvy, so I feel the need to qualify how it is spelled, which is SAVVY dot COOP. So many people spell it with a double A constantly.
Oh, really? Well,
It's like Dutch or something in their minds. I don't know. So it's a double V, savvy.coop. But then you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Horonjeff out there, at least on LinkedIn. I am the last of my family name. My parents and myself are the last ones. So I feel like that's why I kept my maiden name.
wow.
It will live on.
That's awesome. I'll include some of that in the show notes, so it's easy to click on something. But Jen, this has been an absolute pleasure as always, and I kind of wish that we'd been in Austin together in March, but also pleased that we weren't.
Exactly. It's the right thing to do. We get to connect virtually, and it will make the next time we all see each other that much more special, even if it's just fist bumps and elbow taps. I can't wait till we can all be together again.
Thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.